Hey, Diva family. We have arrived at episode 15. And with all the previous episodes, you've heard me describe how I met the sister I am interviewing. And while I have been in many rooms and on several stages as this week's guest, this is the first time she and I have actually seen each other in person. That's because all those previous rooms and stages were on the Clubhouse app, which is audio only. While I may have only known her by her voice up until today, I can say that I have respected and admired that voice and what she has had to say.
Mm.
So I'm honored to have Tricia Eastman on Psychedelic Divas today. Let me tell you a little bit about her before we get rolling. Tricia Eastman is a lineage honoring medicine woman, author, and pioneer in the psychedelic movement, recognized for integrating ancestral wisdom with modern therapeutic practices. With Mestiza roots, she has undergone over a decade of initiations in the Bwiti tradition of Gabon, Africa, and has trained with the Kogi Kagaba of Colombia. Tricia has facilitated psychospiritual programs incorporating Ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT at Crossroads Treatment Center in Mexico, and has curated transformative plant medicine retreats worldwide. Her book, Seeding Consciousness, Plant Medicine, Ancestral Wisdom, and Psychedelic Initiation, explores how psychedelics can help cultivate new beliefs, heal trauma, and access latent gifts. So, welcome to Psychedelic Divas, Tricia.
Oh, it's such an honor to be here, and you're the queen of intros. And yeah, we've had some incredible conversations over Clubhouse and just like sisters in the psychedelic movement for so many years now that it's just so nice that we're finally getting to have a proper conversation.
Yes,
So thank
totally.
you.
Yes, no, it was my pleasure. So here's the thing. I have this safety guide that I wrote. And one of the things that I say in the safety guide is if you're working or looking to work with an individual or in a group setting, and the person calls themselves a shaman and they don't have deep multi-decade tradition behind that, that you should run. And you don't call yourself a shaman, but you do have that lineage behind you. And so, can you share your personal journey that led you to work with plant medicines and indigenous healing traditions?
Yeah, it's interesting because my great great grandmother, Jesus, she was born in Oaxaca, but lived in Jalisco, and she snuck across the border with her daughter, Maria and Katerina, and my grandfather, who was a very young baby at the time. And essentially, they carried a lineage of Afro-Mestiza shamanism. So it's the combination of curanderism with Santeria and Catholicism. And my grandfather learned that tradition, practiced that tradition, but in the
So,
United
what
States,
tell us? So, because again, there's a lot of people here who have no idea what any of those words mean. Okay. So, can you go back and just dive in a little deeper to what those traditions, what came across the border?
thank you. Yeah, when what really was the strength is that in the curanderism traditions of Mexico, we use different plants like sage and rosemary and lavender, but mostly prayer for healing. And in the tradition of Santeria, which came from the Yoruba tradition, which is from Western Africa, there's different orishas that you work with different deities. So my grandmother was working with different deities, doing different prayer. And interestingly, my grandfather turned away from that tradition, but he still carried the prayers, he still carried the powers of divination and the mystical practices that he brought. And that's kind of how my mom came into her spirituality. So when I grew up with a mother who prayed with me every day. She grew all of her own plants in the garden. Whenever I needed healing, she would say, go into yourself. go into prayer. She would say, this is the plant that you need to drink. This is the essential oil that you need for healing. She had an entire library of books of different plants for like healing. We grew up not using any chemicals. We ate only holistic food. I'm born in 1980. So during that time period, all my friends were eating like macaroni and cheese, and I had the most boring school lunches and all of that. But what really cemented in me, most importantly, was this connection to the realms of the angels and the realms of prayer. And the idea that even though my mother eventually became Christian, like as a very young child, she became Christian, I personally had a Gnostic relationship with, I would call it, I carry it to this day, a non spiritual or non religious but spiritual tradition. And interestingly, as I got older, so my father grew cannabis as a child. My parents got divorced, so he didn't raise me. My stepdad raised me. But as a teenager, I got into cannabis. I started working with LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA. I worked for a psychedelic bookstore in college called Raver Books. We got connected with Dance Safe, which started in
Mm-hmm.
Seattle. That's where I'm from. And we're working, helping people in raves with harm reduction. This was like back in 1998, back in like the big kind of heyday of the rave times when we were testing ecstasy pills. And then I came into age 28 where I had stopped working with psychedelics for probably about little less than 8 years, and primarily because of all of the bad media, these stories that came out about MDMA and it causing brain damage. And I had a traumatic brain injury at age 28. And I didn't realize that I had a traumatic brain injury because there really wasn't the type of medical knowledge to tell people, what do you do to treat? To this day, there aren't really any true treatments for traumatic brain injury. So at that time, it triggered all of this anxiety in me, and it kind of triggered I would say, an event that caused me to turn deep back into my mystical roots. And in that, I returned back to MDMA and shortly thereafter met ayahuasca. And in this journey of meeting these sacred plants, I came across a doctor in Mexico, Martin Polanco, who owns a clinic called Crossroads. And Crossroads was one of the first Ibogaine clinics doing Ibogaine, but they switched the practice, and I was one of the first people to go through their psycho-spiritual program using Ibogaine, which is an extract from a plant from Africa called Iboga, and 5-MeO-DMT. And the thing about Iboga is that this is an ancestral practice in Gabon. So immediately I felt this connection to my ancestors. And here I was in Mexico, in Baja, Mexico, but feeling this deep reconnection to my ancestral lineage on my mother's side of the family. And so, really, I feel that it was something in my bloodline that had been lost, but not completely. The essence of it remained. And I feel like that's what gave our bloodline so much strength to be able to get through so many of the struggles that I feel we went through, which could be a whole podcast in itself, like all the trauma in my family. And if it wasn't for Iboga, I feel I was one of those ancestors that came to kind of change that timeline, to really put that. My mother was one of them, is one of them as well, but one of those people that really just said, here it goes. We're going to, instead of running away from this trauma through addiction, through abuse, through all of these things, we're going to face this stuff. We're going to turn inwards. We're going to tap into the spiritual power and the healing technologies that come from ancestral healing, like Iboga and all of these sacred plant medicines that are now available to all of us. So that was in 2014 that I met Martine, and I had my first experience with Ibogaine. And In the medicine, I had one of the most profound healing
Mm.
experiences I've ever experienced. And I had worked with ayahuasca, I had worked with other plant medicines, I had worked even with 5-MeO DMT once prior to this experience, which was a profound experience, but I still couldn't get to the core of these eating disorders that were really hard for me to get to what was the root of the issue. And in the medicine, I realized it was this deep separation that occurred for me in really, I think, a pattern of many different events, some of them events that happen in the womb that led to really feeling that sense of separation from the world, from God, from life. And it kind of put everything back together again, where I could see that I wasn't separate, that I was one with all things, and not like those unified experiences like when you take 5-MeO and you work with it and you kind of dissolve into the oneness, but seeing yourself as a separate being that's part of everything, yet not separate from it, kind of like the jewel in Indra's net, connected to the web of life. And I said to the medicine, and in this, I never imagined that this would be where I would be today, like working with people with powerful psychoactive plants, going to Africa, doing 10 years worth of study and initiations in the Witi tradition. But I said to the medicine, how can I serve you? How can I give back? This is the greatest gift I could receive. I want to give something back. And within 3 weeks, Martine asked me if I would facilitate the psychospiritual program for Crossroads Abigail. So I said yes, and to be frank, I had no idea what I was doing. Luckily, my husband, who was there with me in this journey the whole step of the way, is a psychologist. He worked for MAPS. He was trained in MDMA therapy with Andy and Michael Mithofer. In the clinic, we had a whole team of doctors and clinicians, and it wasn't like I was doing it by myself in any way, but I was able to learn over those 10 years. And I would say, as someone who's been on that path of complete ignorance of what these medicines do and how they work and how they're facilitated, to where I am now looking back 10 years later, that it's really, really important as we're moving forward. Like, my heart and my soul want everyone who has a deep desire to work with these medicines to have that access in some way. And I believe that if you truly do, the medicines have a mystical aspect to them that allows that pathway to open. I
They
mean, it
will
did.
they will find you. Yes, they will. I want to go. I want to go. There were so many things here that you just said.
Yeah, sorry, long story.
No, not at all. It's an amazing story. But I want to go back into the childhood for a little bit
Yeah.
because there's two things here. So here you're getting this training from your mother that
Mhm.
most of us did not receive, right? And then you also dropped in this sense of disconnection and separation and eating disorder. And so I'm wondering, as a child, as your mother was teaching you these really deep, profound spiritual teachings, like
Mhm.
where did it land and then where did it go into separation? There's so many people who feel that place of separation, but the children also know their path, right? So
Yeah.
I'm curious as to any little tidbits around that for you.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things. One thing is my trauma goes all the way back to the womb. And Brigitte Graf, Stan's wife, and
Hmm.
I had this beautiful conversation just recently about this because it's very rare. But when your mother has a Royce's negative blood type, and the father has Royce's positive, a lot of times you have to get this antigen well, you should always get, if you're aware of it, get this antigen shot so that the body doesn't abort the fetus. What most people don't realize, and this is something that I've only heard Brigitte talk about, and then there's one other person trained under her Groff Legacy training who only speaks Spanish, who talks about it as well, which I need to translate her lectures. But essentially, the fetus is attacked from
Hmm.
all corners because the immune system sees this Rh positive blood fetus as a threat. And so, literally, my mother was trying to kill me. So, even though she was the best mother on the entire planet, and really an expression of the Divine Mother, my mom just is one of the most humble, loving, incredible people. But at the same time, as in the womb, she was essentially trying to kill me. And the whole concept of the perinatal matrix, which is typically based on astrology, and this is something that Stan Groff looked at and really is based in archetypal astrology, which is that there are four fixed points, fixed stars that are archetypal that dictate kind of your hero's journey. What is your trauma path as you grow older? So the way that that expressed itself as a child was that from kindergarten all the way through high school, I had two women, one specifically, that were the worst bullies, and they bullied me horrifically
Hmm.
through childhood. And no human being is 100% perfect. And also, I had a very domineering, abusive stepfather. And so my mom, even though she was an amazing human being, she did have this kind of bypass where she had this codependency pattern in this relationship with my stepfather. And so I would say that those were the things I think that really were the issues. I think it was the biggest sense of separation because you can't see the blind spot. It was like the blind spot was put into my imprint. It was in my template in the womb. And it's like around this, like being attacked in this core safety. And even like to this day, I do a lot of somatic body work, and there is terror living in
Hmm.
my nervous system. And I would get into these deep, like holotropic states through holotropic, transpersonal states through holotropic breath work, where some of those terrors would come out of my body. And I would be like, where is this coming from? And I would
Right.
do like past
Yeah.
life regressions and all these different things and be like trying to follow the trail and it not making any sense. And so really that is a real lived experience of the nervous system. And I'm really happy to share it because I'm sure there's other people that have that thing that they can't get to and they don't understand why. I don't remember being beaten as a child. I
Right.
don't remember this happening, and that wasn't so bad. But that is a real thing that exists in the nervous system.
It's so interesting. I've never actually spoken about this with anybody else or had someone talk about like clearing things that they don't know. What is this?
Mm-hmm.
There's been times when, and 5-MeO especially is one of the
Mm-hmm.
places, and for me, it would be incephalated, snuffed 5-MeO, not
Mm-hmm.
smoked. And that I'm clearing, sobbing, as if my entire village had been massacred in front of me, level sobbing. And I'm like, I I had a good life. I had a blessed childhood. What is this?
Mm-hmm.
And then I've asked, and there's a lot of the times no content to it. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
and what I don't know if this is true. I'm just gonna say that one time when I asked that, I was like, what is this? It was
Mm-hmm.
like you just took on a portion. You said you would agree to clear just a portion of the grief. I think specifically the divine feminine grief that hasn't been able to be expressed. And that I just decided that I agreed that I would embody and release some of that. Now, that's kind of crazy. I have no idea whether that's true, but there is this place where there's so often deep emotion happening within the body, deep release happening without content
Mm-hmm.
that I've always just been so curious about.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that story because in my book, Seeding
Hmm.
Consciousness, there's a woman that I worked with that gave me permission to share this experience that she saw herself as a soul being born into the spirit world, departing from the spirit world. And she was on this boat. She was being like sent off, and all of the people that she loved were on the shore. She's hugging them goodbye. And there's this kind of woman who, she kind of saw as like a divine goddess who basically tells her that she was given a mission. And
Hmm.
part of that mission that she accepted was to be a pain keeper.
Mm.
And the pain keepers were people who were helping process the pain for humanity. And I think of that from an archetypal perspective as the archetype of the martyr. And she is a Virgo, and Virgos tend to archetypally match that same imprint of that martyr archetype. And literally, she saw herself traveling in the darkness in this little boat, and she could see all these other people next to her also traveling that were other pain keepers that had all together. And she was like a little sad, but at the same time, like, this is what I'm here to do.
I am not one of those. I know that. But what you describe of the saying goodbye, the leaving, this is my teacher, Ralph Metzner. He would guide us to a place called the Soul Council.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Soul Council is the place where the soul gathers with all the other souls who are going to be part of the life. You've chosen the life. You're like this,
Mm-hmm.
and you've made agreements. You will be my father this lifetime. You will be my mother this lifetime. You know what the DNA pool is. You've chosen and all of that, and now you're making agreements with all the important souls in your life. All right,
Mm-hmm.
I'll meet you in my 30s. You'll do this, and some of those agreements are hard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are not positive. Some of them are, but they're in service of the soul's mission. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's one of the deepest teachings that I've received in this lifetime is to go back and back to the Soul Council and to keep
Mm-hmm.
asking, what are our agreements as I meet somebody new? So I was like, oh, do we have agreements? And what are they? And do we still need to hold to them? Can we let them go? Can we build new agreements? And to work those places of challenge and difficulty, because yes, you did do that for my purpose, but that's done now. Can we let that go?
Mm-hmm.
And not, we don't have to hold on to that enmity or negativity or whatever. And so I love that here's someone who did not learn that from Ralph, but who's having that experience of, okay, bye guys, I'll see you as you come down and choose to incarnate into this lifetime, into this chosen lifetime. I know what I'm signing up for, which is a powerful reframe.
Yeah, I think it's important to have these conversations because I think a lot of the direction that materialist science around psychedelics is going is not necessarily capturing this essence of the experience, but also not really truly acknowledging it. And in the lineage of Fang that I was initiated in, our Bwiti master who passed about 2 years ago, Atum Rabinga, he says very clearly that the base understanding is that life is a school,
Mm.
that you come
Hmm.
here to
Yeah.
learn, and that the people who come here that maybe have chosen specific things, and in no way do I want to be offensive, but even someone who's chosen to come in with some specific handicap, that
Hmm.
they actually chose that because that's a very fruitful life for learning. And saying that in the West isn't necessarily always going to be the most politically correct thing to say, but also like in the equatorial African traditions of Bwiti, they have chosen to live in the jungle in very humble means when they very well could live very prosperous and materialistic lives just like the rest of the world because they believe the riches in life are gained through spiritual experience and that we are here to learn as much as possible and that sometimes materialistic trappings of the Western world can slow us down. And so some of these things that we are in denial of through material science, such as this understanding that this is a school. And then if you believe that this is a school, the prior understanding of that is reincarnation, which I don't know if you've studied Rudolf Steiner's work, but one of his entire life purposes was to spread the idea to the world that they would understand that reincarnation is a real thing. And so now we're starting to see as people are going into these mystical transpersonal experiences, whether with holotropic breath work or with psychedelics, they're having these past life experiences or what you would potentially feel would fit into that category.
Well, Ralph very much seeded that and guided us to look at that. And so, sure, you could say, well, okay, it was his belief system, and you were high, and it imprinted on you. And so, yeah, that's true. But it imprinted in a way that was very deeply personal. He would say, look at your past lives. What is a past life? What are you still working on? Or in other words, it doesn't really matter. I think the first time, very first time I was just doing straight therapy with Ralph before I worked one-on-one with him psychedelically, and he led me into past life regression in his office, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm a shepherd. All right, great. And it's just overview of your life and then see how you die. And I went back to work and I told one of my workmates, I was like, oh, I just did this past life regression and I was a shepherd. And she was like, oh, who wasn't?
Yeah, I mean,
Because yeah, we all weren't, Cleopatra. There was a lot of shepherds.
yes, we were everything. And that I think is a really important thing to acknowledge as we're integrating the understanding of who we are, sexuality, all of these different things. Because my understanding from my teachings in Bhuti was that people reincarnated as a man or a woman in many different lifetimes and all kinds of different gender orientations. And all of it is yeah, I think we get really caught up in the Western world around who we are in this lifetime
Right.
and, what that means. And if you were to really look at it from the span of many lifetimes, we've been everything. We've been the victim, we've been the perpetrator, we've been the
hmm
shepherd, we've been the coyote, I'm sure as well. So,
I think at one point I was like, oh, should I dive into doing ancestry.com? And I was like, well, it's just this one lifetime. Who cares?
yeah.
So it's like, I don't need to know deeply, like tracing all the way back because this lifetime is this and the other times, yes, exactly. I've seen that I've been a man and a woman and I've been in the work that I did with Ralph, I saw that I was not going to have children in this lifetime.
Mhm.
And so I was like, oh, okay. So I grieved that in the moment, but it was a choice I had made not to have children. And so I was like, yeah, that makes sense. But then I saw that I had many children
Mhm.
and then had the energetic experience of that. And I was like, oh, and I'll have that again. And so there was no ultimate loss. It was just it's a continual journey of, and when am I today? When am I this lifetime? When am I holding this time? And holding that worldview has been really profound for me because, first of all, it means there's no victim if I chose. Of like, oh, so then the question is, well, why would I choose that?
Mhm.
What was that here to serve? What was my life's purpose? And then
Mhm.
how does that align? How does that? And when you start looking at it from that perspective, your ownership of your world really expands. You step into empowerment from that place. And you know
Yeah.
what? I don't know if it's right or not, but that is a powerful place to hold your life from.
Yeah. And I think also when you think about the collective of who you were and how many faces that represents. And then we look at the idea of the world that we live in today and how many people live in this world. The idea and understanding of past lives, I think, can also bring greater unification with all people because we
I
start
agree.
start to
Right.
realize that we're all one. And I love what you brought up about soul contracts, because one school that I studied, which is based off the I Ching, is human design, which human design and gene keys are kind of like very similar and have become very popular. And when you read human design charts, so you have, the 64 different kind of representations of the elements in the I Ching, which are all representative of archetypal energies and influenced by the time that you're born. When you look at the chart, there's these different channels, and then the chart is essentially a map of the human body, and you'll see that you have half of a channel. And if you go into the book, which like in Gene Keys, you can literally open the book and you can go to Gene Key 55 and you can read exactly what that lesson is and what it's connected with. But interestingly, in the relationship charts that I would do, you would see that having half of a channel creates an electromagnetic pole. And so if you think about like family constellation work,
Hmm.
like these modalities where people come in with an intention of doing work on the family constellation, and how, people are in such awe, like, how is it that this guy showed up that's just like my uncle, and this guy's my dad, and this guy's my brother. And really, it's those archetypal gates that pull those people into your field, like a romantic interest, and, even can determine like sexual chemistry that you have with somebody. If you don't have a lot of those gates, you probably aren't going to have, like that magnetic, draw to be together.
Well, so that's fascinating. All right. We got to go back to there's so many different directions, but so you have this deep lineage of ancestral teachings. How do you balance that with contemporary therapeutic modalities?
I believe if you really look at the history of all traditions and the ones that have evolved, Bwiti is an evolving tradition and has evolved with time, that these types of evolution are necessary. And so I think there's a unique way of understanding and having a deep understanding of the laws of nature. The Hermetic principles would be another way of speaking of that, or in different indigenous traditions, you have original principles or primordial principles. And really, if you go to the basis of all of those traditions, I actually taught a class at Stanford for the School of Design about this, how these original principles are missing from our
Mhm.
society. But how do you translate that in a way? For example, you have the 42 principles of Ma'at. Ma'at is the goddess in Egypt who weighs your heart against the feather when you die and you cross through the duat. And if your heart's too heavy, you don't cross through. And what do these principles really mean? These are guiding principles that allow us to live free. They're not like disciplines or dogmas that we're going to be punished by in some
Mm-hmm.
religions, but they are truly there to liberate us. Having compassion, having forgiveness isn't just for the other. It's for you too, because you know that if you hold things in your heart, or if you hold prejudice, or everything is a mirror of yourself. If you can't have compassion for others, you can't have compassion for yourself. And so I really truly believe that in studying the traditions, and then also coming into this new era where we're in, where we're looking at therapy and we're looking at really the translation of communication, of how do we translate that in a modern world, which I feel like things like the gene keys are a good example of a modern translation of one of the most ancient sacred texts, the I Ching, which was from China and is the whole basis of Chinese medicine.
Hey, fellow explorers. Thoughtful planning and preparation is the foundation of any successful psychedelic journey. And if something does go wrong, knowing how to navigate that difficult space is essential. That's why I wrote my psychedelic safety guide, including what to do when things go wrong. It's filled with tips and tools for keeping you and your friends as safe as possible. You'll find it at our website, psychedelicdivas.com. Please, go get it, read it, and share it. The more we all know, the safer we can keep each other. Thanks. So let's go and do another deep dive with your work with Iboga and Ibogaine, because I haven't spoken much about those substances on this podcast, and I know that they're certainly not in the top five of what the psychedelics people are doing out there. So can you tell us some more about your experience with each of those?
Yeah, so is the one of the alkaloids in Iboga. Iboga is a root from equatorial Africa, from a small country called Gabon, which is about the size of Colorado. And it's one of the few places that is mostly rainforest.
Hmm.
It holds probably more biodiversity there that, I mean, there's probably a very small places in the entire world, one being the Amazon rainforest, parts of the Amazon rainforest that have that much biodiversity. And this plant, depending on its age, depending on its subspecies, because there are different species of Tabernanthe iboga, can have up to 80 alkaloids. It was historically recorded in other research in the last decade, maybe 30 alkaloids, but 50% of the alkaloid profile, the dominant alkaloid in this plant, is ibogaine. And ibogaine and iboga are an oneirophrenic, and oneros is the word for dreams. So it's puts you in a dreamlike state. And really, when you think about the effects of the medicine, number one, it's a very long acting medicine. It's extremely intense. It's called, in many cases, the Mount Everest of psychedelics. It's not meant for the weak of heart, literally. You
No.
have to have a cardiac exam and make sure that your heart doesn't have any issues. But also, I believe that those who do not have some kind of rooted spiritual practice, who have done some trauma work, or have some kind of inner resilience, that could be someone who's been a professional athlete or a veteran, they've gone through boot camp, which is pretty intense, tend to do good with this medicine. And it is very long acting. So typically, you're in this state where you're incapacitated. You cannot move. Literally, it is a purifying medicine. It can cause, in general, it's actually good if you purge on this medicine, much like ayahuasca. Typically, you purge at least once early on in the medicine. I wouldn't say there's a timeline with Iboga to when you purge or how much you purge. You can purge quite a lot, but really it's designed to clear things out of you, toxins in the body. And I think what is really interesting is that the more recent research has shown that it has the most profound neuroregenerative effects of any medicine. There was a recent study that was done at a clinic in Mexico called Ambio, and there were lesions in the brain related to, I want to say, multiple sclerosis, but please don't quote me on that. It was, I'm pretty sure it's multiple sclerosis, literally holes in the brain. And there was a before scan showing holes in the brain, and the after scan, which was with one flood dose of ibogaine, which is measured out milligram per kilogram by body weight. So the dosage varies depending on body weight. The lesions were completely gone. And then there was another study that was done by a Dr. Nolan Williams, who's out of Stanford University. And it was done with some veterans who had traumatic brain injury And in these veterans, they showed an average of essentially turning back the clock on the age of the brain based on the scans of what the scan would assess the brain age at before and after by 1.3 years.
Wow.
So it's pretty significant in its effects, but it's also very significant in its risks if it's not done
Hmm.
properly. And this is why in traditional practice, if you want to be a Nima is the essentially initiators in Bhuiti that perform the initiations, and these rituals are elaborate. We're talking weeks of bathing and purification rituals and smoke baths and different types of plants that are taken to cure specific issues. So the individual is doing divination and doing assessment based on different. The last time I did an initiation just recently, I was having some problems where I was like, oh, I'm having some skin issues and I'm having this or that. And they're prescribing specific plants for those issues. And I'm also going through this ritual of these different purifications, of taking different vomitifs to purge even before taking the medicine, taking this very burning substance through the nostrils that turned my brain. It felt like my brain was like on fire and different things like that. And depending on the lineage and where it's performed, it can be done in different ways. And so the differences I would say between Iboga and Ibogaine is that when you work with Iboga, there is really not a lot of margin for error
Hmm.
related to the dosage level, potentially people being spun out because of improper dosage, or maybe someone who was not really appropriate or like ready to take the medicine. And that's why these initiatory commitments of a minimum of 10 years of training are required to make up for that lack of training in the West, because obviously people have not, like I'm 10 years, but I did not live in Gabon for 10 years. I have nowhere near the amount of wisdom and training that Anima, who's graduated, has. You have to have medical supervision because you are pushing people to the edge of their psyche. This medicine forces you to look at your shadow. Many times people experience a life review where
Hmm.
literally they're being faced with the most painful things that they've experienced in their life. And these are things like if someone has been using some kind of substance abuse to escape, they're having to look at something they've been running from
Yeah.
for a long time, which can be very difficult. So that's
Well,
where,
so, and that is just, let's just say
yeah, yeah.
that is what Ibogaine is used for. So,
Mm,
can you speak a little bit to that is the power of it for people
yes.
who are going into opiate withdrawal or other substance abuse withdrawal?
Yeah, so I was just talking about the most recent research earlier, but historically, this was discovered back in the 1950s by Howard Letzoff, and he discovered that accidentally, having an opiate addiction himself, but being someone who's researched other substances, psychoactive substances for the purposes of healing, discovered that it cured his opiate addiction or interrupted. They call it an addiction interrupter because it specifically has these alkaloids work on the kappa mu system, which is the kappa opioid receptors. And so for, I would say, maybe a little less than 2 decades, it's been used primarily in Mexico, Canada, but other places in the world, obviously Africa, but in South Africa, there are clinics where people go and receive treatment specifically for detox. And these are
Hmm.
people who have, been in treatment. And we know that a lot of these treatment centers have a 3% success rate. Um, and when you take one flood dose of Ibogaine, the success rate is roughly about 33%,
Hmm.
which is significant in comparison to everything else that is
But
available.
it's not. an easy journey necessarily.
No.
So so that's the thing. That's you're like, okay, I'm ready. I'm committing to this level of change. And then the
Mhm.
medicine, as you said, one of the most, I think one of the most common things is that people may experience a life review where they're
Mhm.
being shown the damage that they've done as a result of their years of substance abuse, not just to themselves, but to their world. And so it not only resets the receptors so that they're not craving anymore, but
Mhm.
they're also having a psychological reset. Like I can't do this anymore to others. I think that's the way it's been described to me. But
Yes.
tell me, you've actually worked with people with this, so tell me how this has shown up for people.
Yeah, when you're coming in specifically for addiction, number one, the medicine completely incapacitates you. So you can't move. If you try to distract yourself, you can have buzzing in the ears and other types of auditory hallucinations. So it's really focusing you inward. If you try to get up and walk around, you'll become very dizzy, very nauseous. Even getting up to go to the bathroom can be really harrowing because you're feeling really sick and disoriented. And it really essentially cuts off all your senses so
Hmm.
that you kind of are walking around like a drunk person when you try to move. And what that's meant to do is kind of put you in this corpse pose. And in the Bwiti tradition, they talk about the idea of death. The idea of death and rebirth is really primary to what Bwiti is. And so it's this idea of dying to your old self. And so when you look at it from its mechanism, so the first thing it's doing is it's resetting everything. It works on nearly every receptor: serotonin, dopamine, opioid receptors. It's going through and doing all these neuroregenerative things. So the things that you potentially did damage to yourself from whatever substances you may have been taking, whether it was alcohol, which my husband did a poster of a brain scan of someone with alcoholism who is a veteran several years ago, before and after, and it had a really incredible before and after of the white matter in the brain. So
Wow.
how the alcohol kind of destroys that, and it kind of had like less blood flow in that portion of the brain in the beginning, and then after just one treatment, the blood flow was more active and the white matter was more visible in the brain scan. So it's repairing some of that damage, which sometimes people go into these patterns of substance abuse because they had an injury. They
Hmm.
had a traumatic brain injury. They had some form of PTSD. And I feel like all of these things affect the brain and the nervous system. And so something that is like going in and healing all of that, not just taking the addiction, for example, with opioids, the kappa opioid receptors being completely reset. So there's no longer a craving for the drug, being opiates, but also regenerating so that the body has a new place to start off from, like a new beginning. And then interestingly, the Ibogaine, as well as the other alkaloids in Iboga, are stored in the fat in the body, which the brain is made of fat. And so in the month after, there's a visible window of feeling really good,
Mm.
where all of these alkaloids are kind of microdosing into the body every day, kind of sustaining. And really, in the tradition, they call this mabondo, which is grace. It's this time period where you have this opportunity to create new habits and change your life.
Yeah.
And so you go through, you do this life review, and you're like realizing the patterns that got you to where you were or contributed to where some of the problems are in your life. And you realize what you need to do. And you have this very supportive window of time where you're able to kind of cement these new patterns in place. And of all of the medicines, I'm trying to remember the name of the doctor. She's the one that did the octopus MDMA study.
Oh,
I wish
Ghoul Dolan.
Gould, she did the study on I love her, by the way.
Yes, we everybody loves Ghoul.
So Gould did the study on the neuroplasticity
Hmm.
window after
Yes.
psilocybin, MDMA, and it
Hmm.
was obvious that Abigail.
The longer when I've talked to her about this,
Yeah,
so the longer the substance is in your system, the longer the window stays open. So
yeah,
LSD longer than psilocybin,
yeah,
and Iboga Ibogaine being the longest in the system. So it keeps the
yeah,
window, the critical window, which is when you can actually relearn that. Yeah, it's all about neuroplasticity. The critical window is, or the critical period is open like 0 to 5, 0 to 6. It's when the brain
yeah,
learns everything, and then it closes and it reopens again during after a stroke or after a traumatic brain injury, because the brain's, oh, we need to relearn things, and then it closes again. And Gould has proven that psychedelics open the critical period.
yeah.
And the longer the substance is in your body, the longer the critical period stays open. So a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So being working with somebody post an Iboga journey with this life review that you're talking about, oh, now I know what I need to do. There's actually, the brain is open and supportive of all of those new ways of learning and being and doing. So it's a powerful opportunity.
Yeah, and I think it's like based on her study, I think it was like a month. It
I
was
think
the
you're right for Iboga, because it's
for,
about, I think it's like 3 weeks for LSD, and maybe, and I think 2 weeks for psilocybin. And
yeah,
4 hours get you like 2 weeks, and 8 hours get you three, and Iboga being longer get you, yeah, you
a
have like
month.
about a month. Yeah.
Yeah. And I personally believe, just from seeing from my own work and my own initiations, and typically in these more initiatic experiences, you're taking very high doses and you're not getting up after 8 hours and you're doing it like 2 days. And so
Mhm.
I've felt like for me, like that critical period was sometimes up to 3 months.
Probably.
And I could feel it. And it feels like a very supportive time where it's almost getting an extra pillow, an extra like cloud of snuggle from the universe, where it's you're not like having the brash harshness of the world like smacking up against you while you're trying to like learn to walk again. It seems very supportive. And I believe like in our world and what we do and how we do things, that intentionality is really key. So I believe that how you do one thing is how you do everything. And in those critical windows, whether it's with Ibogaine or psilocybin mushrooms or LSD, that's a time where if you really take the time to slow down and really do things intentionally, like even how you clean your house, how you cook dinner, how you connect with people, that it can really stay with you for a long time.
Well, now we're talking integration, because that those statements are true no matter what medicine you're doing. It's the journey itself is its experience, but it's how
Mhm.
you are after the journey. It's how you integrate the messages, how you integrate this new way of being into your life with intentionality, with an extra pillow, with focus, is
Mm.
where the change happens. And so someone going down to, say, Crossroads to work on their substance abuse issues, they're staying for a longer time period, right? They're
Mhm.
staying in order to get that therapeutic support, that
Yeah.
integration of the messages of the change, because that's what they have to go home with, is because the journey itself is a blip. It's the after work that is really what changes everything. And
Yes.
so you were that's what you were working with Crossroads. So what have you learned around integration from all of that sort of deep dive? What can you share with people who are maybe new to psychedelics, or like they've done psychedelics and have never really thought about integration at all?
I think this is really kind of the premise. And when I was in Gabon, I was in an initiation called Mimbara, and it's the initiation of Ma'at, which is the goddess in Egypt, which is really about understanding karma, but also having that light heart, like following the
Hmm.
primordial principles. And I would say what I saw that's missing from the modern day framework of psychedelics is this initiatic framework. If you take the template of the initiation, which is this long, drawn out process of deep preparation, the kind of experience itself, and then the integrative phase,
Hmm.
of the experience. I feel like we're very lacking in the West in the preparation phase of the
Yes.
experience
Hmm.
and the integration phase of the
Yes.
experience. And I think that there's something to the idea that we begin as integration. So, how we start, how we put time aside, how we really think about who's the community that we want around us, how we want our life to be coming out of the experience. How do we prepare to set those conditions so that they manifest in the most supportive way? All of that starts at the very beginning. And so that's really, I think, starts with finding the right support team, finding people that have that experience and understanding from being in the field, from really working with people, from their education, whether it's traditional practice or psychological training. And then, really within themselves, I think it's really identifying where the holes are within their own self care. And these are all things that you don't have to know the answers going in, because the best thing about coming to the medicine is number one, you get to have three intentions or more or less whatever you want, because psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers. So we come in with the intention to help direct the medicine as a tool. It's a
Hmm.
tool, just like a
Yeah.
car.
Right.
You're
Where am I
this way.
going?
You're not
Set the
necessarily,
GPS.
yeah, it's like I'm not running the engine of my car. Like I'm not in charge of the car being on or operating correctly, but I am in charge of the wheel. So I have some agency here, and the intentions I feel are in some ways the steering wheel
Hmm.
of the experience. So it's really taking that time to
Hmm.
feel in to why am I here?
Hmm.
And then with that, what are some deep questions that I have within myself around who I am, what I'm meant to do, what I'm experiencing in life, what things I keep running up against. Um, and you don't necessarily have to ask those questions in the medicine. They may not come up in the medicine. I feel like sometimes they might just randomly come up as an answer. Sometimes there might be a gap where you're engaging with, like in Iboga, sometimes you'll have different entities that will approach you and talk, and you can engage with them and ask questions. So it might be an opportunity to engage within the medicine. And so having some questions in mind is great, so that you know what you're going to do. Be like, all of a sudden you have Krishna standing in front of you and you're like,
Like,
what do I ask you? Man, I wish I would have asked that thing. And then afterwards, there is a beautiful, beautiful time of contemplative practice, which is taking the time for reflection, taking the time just for the body to fully kind of settle into the experience itself. Like journaling, all of these practices, I feel like they somaticize the
hmm.
experience. I
Hmm.
don't even know if that's a word, but they
Works for me.
draw them into the body and make them more real in the physical being. And I feel like our journal prompts and different things that you can do around the experience
Hmm.
itself. And I feel like sometimes coming directly out of it, there may have been things that you forgot, but being in that neuroplastic window, things will just kind of come through and
Hmm.
trickle through slowly. And so it's like really taking advantage of that time. And I would say the other thing that really is missing, that, well, I shouldn't say it's missing, but it's not talked about enough, is that in the Western culture, we utilize our minds a lot to
Yes.
look at things or to process things or talk even about things. But the body keeps the score, as
Hmm.
Besser, what is his name?
Bessel
Besser
van der Kolk.
Esther Van der Kolk. I'm like having name recall today. And really, a lot of the trauma that we have lives in the physical body.
Hmm.
And so I've been a deep believer. Before I came to my work doing this, I was I was working in the spa industry and I got to help design spas and menus and treatments. And I got to really understand and even train in different modalities of somatic body work. And what I would say that's really missing as an emphasis in the space, and I think even sometimes more effective than psychotherapy, is somatic body work. And
Mm-hmm.
there's modalities such as somatic experiencing or different types of like myofascial release,
Mm-hmm.
and rolfing is something that I do regularly. And essentially, that's getting into the deep fascia, which is where a lot of those traumas
Right.
live, and moving that and moving these stagnancies out of the body. And I think the more free we can feel in our body, working with people that have really studied under a tradition of somatic body work, that
Mm-hmm.
really are good and understand the structure of the body, profound things can happen. Like my body is completely changed from that work. So I always really recommend even weeks coming into doing some type of experience, whether it's Ibogaine or psilocybin or Iboga or LSD, doing some somatic body work before and then as an integration after as well. And I think people actually will find it's easier to surrender in the medicine. The more open your body is, the more open your breathing is, the more you're going to be able to go deep into the medicine. And it's not just about understanding how to breathe, but it's if our rib cage is crunched in and our shoulders, and we're on computers and cell phones and all these things, if we have these patterns in our body and then we're like really wanting to open up and receive, it's hard. So
Tricia, thank you so much for your time and your deep commitment to the global world of psychedelics. How can people find you and support your work?
my deepest passion, I've been doing biocultural work, working really closely with the Bwiti tradition from Gabon, because Iboga, and especially with all the interest in the West with Iboga and Ibogaine, it's causing sustainability issues because this
Mhm.
plant only grows in one part of the world. So I feel that it's our responsibility as a society to protect this plant, to protect the biocultural heritage of Bwiti. So my website, ancestralheart.com, is where you can learn more about the work that I'm doing with that, as well as I'm working in Colombia in the Amazon rainforest, working with the Kogi Kagaba. And we've done 3 land trusts so far where we've bought back the land for biocultural stewardship and research. And it's been a really incredible experience. And my vision for the next decade is really the indigenous peoples of this planet are stewarding 70% of the biocultures, the biodiversity
Wow.
of this planet. And so if we can really empower the wisdom keepers that already know exactly how to take care of Mother Nature and how to help her flourish, which she's flourishing in these areas, not as much as she used to be, but in comparison to other places in the world because of this stewardship. But how can we continue to support that? And so I would really love to see that idea spread. And then I would love for people to pick up my book, Seeding Consciousness, Plant Medicine, Ancestral Wisdom, and Psychedelic Initiation, so you can learn more about kind of this synthesis of how we move forward.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
thank you all for listening and for your support. If you found this conversation to be helpful in any way, please stop what you're doing right now and go to wherever you're listening or watching and click on the 5 stars, or maybe provide a nice comment or a thumbs up if you're on YouTube. This feedback is how we spread the word and helpful, safe information about psychedelics. And speaking of safety, thank you for the positive feedback on my safety guide, which includes critical information about what to do when things go wrong. So if you haven't yet, please check it out at our website, psychedelicdivas.com. It might be just the thing you need should things go sideways, and you don't want to have to be scrambling for it once things have gone sideways.
Mm.
As always, thanks for your support and for listening. I so appreciate you all. And thanks again, Tricia. Thank you for a beautiful conversation and for your beautiful work.
Thank you.